I think that'll do for us to get started. Good morning, everybody. And oh, there goes the slide. I'm sure that'll be back shortly. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Evans. I am a parliamentary agent and partner at BDB Pitman's infrastructure planning team, and I would like to welcome you to our first business breakfast webinar of 2022. And this time we are very pleased to be joined by Martin Tugwell, Chief Executive of Transport for the North. And Martin, joining us here in a particularly timely fashion, as today is the day that we expect to see the high speeds to private hybrid bill from authorising phase 2B from Crewe to Manchester appear in Parliament. So those of us who are parliamentary agents can start digging into the details of the law there. And Martin, as the transport professional, can actually tell us what it's going to mean. And in particular, just to introduce Martin, he's had 20 years of leadership roles in various public bodies, looking particularly at transport, including Oxfordshire County Council, Transport Systems Catapult, the England's Economic Heartland subnational transport body, and now Transport for the North. TFN, of course, are the first statutory subnational transport body, so they exist to produce a statutory transport plan for the North and to give statutory advice to government, which no doubt is very keen to get advice from all sorts of people on all sorts of subjects at the moment. TFN and Martin particularly have a lot on your plate, I know, at the moment, and it's all pretty fast moving, isn't it? You've given your advice on the integrated rail plan, you've produced your major roads report, you're refreshing your transport plan, you've got a decarbonisation strategy, freight and logistics strategy on the way, so there's plenty to tell us about over the next hour or so. Just let everybody know in terms of format, Martin's going to speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll throw the session open to Q&A. If you want to leave a question for Martin, please do so using the Q&A button that should be available at the bottom of the screen. The session is being recorded, so Chatham House rule does not apply this time round. We can't pretend that Martin didn't say something of it, because we'll be sending you a recording of it. So bear that in mind with the comments that you want to put forward. And I should also probably mention, it's traditional at this time, that if there is a fire alarm that goes off, then that's in your own house and you should probably do something about it. So with no further ado, I shall hand over to Martin. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everybody. As you say, it's a particularly notable day today because of the depositing of the next part of the HS2 bill, and of course that's a good example of the importance of investment in infrastructure. It's also quite a busy week for Transport for the North, because the Transport for the North board meet in person tomorrow in Manchester, and if you look at the breadth of the agenda tomorrow, then you'll see the kind of scale of the work that we're doing as an subnational transport body, and how much is actually active at the moment. So I'll talk a little bit about the integrated rail plan to start with this morning, but if you look at the agenda for tomorrow's board meeting, you'll see us talking about short-term business planning for the rail sector. You'll see us talking about longer-term investment in the rail sector. There'll be work around the union connectivity review and our response to that, which is a particularly welcome piece of work, we think, from the government, but also work around the strategic transport plan. So as Nick says, a lot happening and a lot to get through, but hopefully in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you a flavour of where we are at the moment, and a little bit of a sort of forward look, and maybe leave you with a few things to think about for the transport profession, because undoubtedly we are in a period of great change. And for me, one of those biggest challenges for the transport profession is being able to provide the leadership that will mean that we can respond to those changes and actually set an agenda for the future. But of course, the thing that drives me, and in fact drives Transport for the North, is the fact that fundamentally investment in infrastructure and services is essential to every aspect of our community and our lives. It's fundamental to enabling economic growth. In fact, it can be the driver of economic growth. It's important in terms of supporting communities, enabling people to realize their potential, connecting people and places with economic opportunities. It's also the investment we make is really important in terms of enabling and facilitating the change that we need to achieve. And yes, there's a lot of focus around decarbonisation at the moment, but also air quality is an important need for us to address. And I think for me, what we've got to get our heads around and be much more comfortable with is really understanding how those three things link together, because some of the economic opportunities come from the need for change. And some of that change will actually address some of the barriers that exist within society, which actually prevent people from realizing their potential. And I think we look to the future. One of the challenges for me as a profession is how do we make sure that what we're doing is relevant for all of our community, for all of our society, and doesn't inadvertently serve to perhaps reinforce or even widen the divides within some of our communities as a consequence of the limitations of our transport system. So it's in that context that clearly the investment that government announced around integrated rail plan, as the scale of that investment is to be welcome. It's, you know, we mustn't underestimate the significance of actually identifying scale of investment that's being announced. But the challenge with that is that when you're making that once in a lifetime investment, you've really got to make sure that what we're doing is setting the right trajectory, is setting us on the direction that we need to achieve. It's focused on delivering outcomes that are in the longer term ambition. And once in a lifetime investment is surely the opportunity to make a difference, to do things differently. And I know there's a lot of debate at the moment, and we'll hopefully see the Levelling Up white paper soon. But for me, at its heart, when people talk about levelling up, in essence, what we're saying is we need to do things differently. The way we've invested in infrastructure and services in the past has created the challenges that we now face. So by extension, if we're going to do and achieve levelling up within our communities, within our society, within our country, we need to do things differently. And so that becomes even more important as to why, when you have the scale of this kind of investment, you're focused on delivering outcomes, and then we're focused equally on actually making the investment be delivered. Because I kind of look over my professional career, and I sometimes feel that we're very good at strategies, very good at identifying and allocating funding, but perhaps not so good on the delivery side. Now, focusing on outcomes is exactly what Transport for the North is about. Our work is very much grounded in evidence. So yes, our politicians and our business leaders on the TfN board are ambitious for the North. They're ambitious for realizing its potential, but that ambition is grounded in understanding and a knowledge of where we start from and of the potential for the future. And so when people think about the proposal that TfN put forward for the integrated rail, for the Northern Powerhouse Rail, it was in response to the independent economic review. Now, sometimes people forget that the independent economic review is actually the catalyst for so much that we do as Transport for the North. It identified the potential of the North economy. It identified how connecting our towns and cities and creating the wider economic activity, the opportunity to go across the region, that was fundamental to realizing that economic potential, both in terms of speed and capacity. This isn't just about one aspect of the transport system, it's about both of those. And of course, more recently, as we've done the work as Transport for the North, we've done work around decarbonisation. And as Nick said in his introduction, last December, we published our regional decarbonisation strategy, the first time that the region had published this, and a reflection, if you like, of what the Transport Decarbonisation Plan nationally says about the role of subnational transport bodies, being a real catalyst for change, and being able to pull across, look across individual transport modes to think about how we get to the future. Now, it's worth reminding people who are listening that our decarbonisation strategy has been built upon a number of future travel scenarios. So we've used a different way of looking at the future, thinking about what might be realistic scenarios and thinking about what those implications might be. And that led to the work that said, here's the route or the routes to achieving near net zero by 2045. But what we must also remember is it's not about the end point, it's about the journey getting there. So if we don't do things and we don't do things quickly, then actually we'll burn through, if you like, a carbon budget for the North much quicker than 2045. So this is not just about where we're trying to get to, but it's the pace at which we go. Now, I talked about it being evidence-based, and that comes from the fact that as if you like, a regional centre of excellence, we have one of the most comprehensive databases and analytical frameworks available. We have understanding about where the scale of development is, where it's planned, the timing. We've got models which look at the strategic road and rail network in a level of detail, which at some levels is as good as, if not better than, some of the infrastructure owners themselves. And we've got the ability to integrate those models together and to integrate them with land use transport models as well. So we have a really powerful package, a really powerful regional evidence base that allows us to understand where we're starting from and allows us to think about what are the implications of alternative futures. But it's also understanding, as we look particularly at things like the IRP, about what's happening now. Because yes, it's great to have that ambition and it's great to see the funding coming through, and we can work together to understand how best to use the funding available to deliver it. But the need for that change is really urgent, because when you look at what's happening with the rail system at the moment, nationally, there may be some debate about the role of rail. Nationally, if you look at the figures in terms of return to rail, it's been fairly steady before this current variant. It's been fairly steady around 65, 70%, something of that order. But here's the rub. In the North, we've been almost back to pre-pandemic levels. One of our operators has been reporting that prior to the recent variant, they were delivering 95% revenue of pre-COVID levels. Another one was talking about traffic levels being at 90% of pre-COVID. Freight paths, freight is already in excess of pre-COVID levels. Now, what this shows is that those pressures and the need for investment in both speed and capacity on the rail network have come back very, very quickly, faster than the rest of the country. And it's probably a reflection of the economic geography and the economic landscape in the North, which is slightly different from perhaps the more service-based economy of London and the Southeast. And what's important is that difference is reflected in the way forward, so that we don't have one approach that is used universally across the country. Where there is market growth, where there is potential and need for investment and growth in the rail network, we need to target it. And again, this is why for us, the challenges that come out of the government's proposals around the IRP remain, because essentially we're still going to have a Victorian two-track railway. And that two-track railway is having to deal with local services, regional services, long-distance services, and freight. And if you think about your own experience when you may be traveling around, maybe on the roads, and you see a mixture of vehicle types, lorries to cars to motorbikes, it's quite a complex, and it becomes very easy to become congested. And you need to think of the railway network in that way, which is why it was so important for us to think about having an investment in terms of new capacity. And it was from that the particular disappointment around the challenges from the IRP about Bradford, where if we had that new link across the Pennines from Manchester through Bradford direct to Leeds, not only would we provide the extra capacity to deal with the growth and the opportunity for freight and passengers across the Pennines, but it would also unlock, particularly in Bradford, places like something like £30 billion of economic uplift over 10 years as a consequence of the catalytic effect that the investment in the rail service would do. We still believe there's opportunities to realise Bradford's potential, and we'll continue to make the case, not just for Bradford, but also for the routes to Hull, the routes along the East Coast main line, all of which are integral to actually getting that step change in terms of investment across the North. So when I think about what happens next with the IRP, we need to make sure we deliver what's in the programme. We need to make sure that we minimise this process, because still too often the process of getting ideas into delivery, it feels like there's a lot of overhead within the system, which actually slows down and delays realising benefits. And we're very much up for continuing to work with government to make sure we do tackle those issues. We need to make sure we do look at it as a programme. I mean, there's various elements within the IRP, and it's important that if there's a cost pressure in one part of the programme, we don't see that cost pressure then having an impact on what's possible within the rest of the programme itself. We don't want to see elements of the investment being delayed or de-scoped as a consequence of challenges elsewhere. We need to think about this as a programme, and we need to work with government to make sure that challenge and approach is adopted. And we still need to keep challenging costs. As TfN, as a co-client, we identified and took out something close to £4 billion worth of costs from the Northern Powerhouse rail proposals that we put forward. And we believe there's about £5 billion more of costs that we could have taken out of that programme. So challenging the industry, challenging costs, focusing on how we turn ideas into delivery is really important moving forward. As I've kind of touched on, where the IRP doesn't address issues, we need to be honest and realise that, you know, the need for investment is not going to go away. If we're going to have the potential of the free ports in places like the Tees Valley or on the Humber, if we're going to have their potential being realised, we need to invest in the strategic infrastructure that unlocks that potential, and particularly in rail freight, where it's becoming increasingly obvious that the market is shifting so that you can see short to medium flows of freight now being attractive to rail, and therefore freeing up capacity and reducing environmental impact. We need to understand that the pressures on places like Leeds, which is already in the top 3 places in the country in terms of delays across the entire rail network, we need to understand there's still going to be a requirement to invest there. And we're going to need to look at how we deliver investment along the East Coast Main Line, which is why proposals like the Leamside line reopening weren't just about serving the communities along the Leamside line. It was about actually providing additional capacity on the north-south route along the East Coast Main Line. Fundamentally, what we've got to do is we've got to start getting better at understanding how much funding is available and how we then prioritise that to be able to deliver investment into the future. And that's where the work of TfN remains so important. Now, all of these challenges and changes that are happening, driven in part by the publication of the IRP, means that TfN itself will evolve over the next few months. But it's very clear to me that it remains focused on realising the economic potential of the North, about making sure that what we're identifying in terms of infrastructure is going to deliver sustainable, long-term sustainable growth, and making sure that it addresses that the extent to which transport is still a barrier for too many people. So moving forward, we'll be continuing to focus on strategy and using our regional evidence base to be able to set out that long-term approach to infrastructure that's going to unlock the North. We're going to make sure we focus on identifying the investment proposals that form part of a long-term programme, and then work with the infrastructure owners to be able to take those elements forward as a programme so that you get the cumulative benefit of individual components coming together to deliver those outcomes. And we'll use our ability to support our partners in developing business cases and making investments ready for delivery on the ground. And we'll do that through embarking firstly on an update of the independent economic review, And secondly, and in parallel, doing an update on the strategic transport plan. And this is going to give us the opportunity, I think, to look at some of the really key issues and look at them in greater detail. How do we use the need to reduce the environmental impact of transport as an economic opportunity as well as an environmental necessity? How do we use the work that we're doing to publish fairly soon around transport-related social exclusion to act as a catalyst to say, how do we really address those barriers? Think about when you're working on projects, think about how what we're proposing might impact on a single parent on a minimum wage in an unsecured job. Think about how minor changes in cost or availability can have really fundamental consequences for them, and contrast that with perhaps some people who are able to afford change more easily. We've got to be thinking about how we remove and address those barriers. We've also got to think about how our proposals reflect the diversity within society. Not every group within society responds to the challenges that we face in the same way. And we've got to be much better at pitching our ideas and our thoughts in a way that speaks to individuals, parts of our community, so that we achieve a collective whole. We often talk about the economy, but we need to remember we've got an aging society, and we need to remember that if we invest in transport and infrastructure to maintain independent mobility for longer, then the evidence is really clear. Keeping people independent, allowing them to go about their lives on a daily basis, means that they'll have better quality of life themselves. But it also means that we'll probably have less demand on social care or health services. So investment in transport can actually be beneficial in terms of reducing the demand for health and social costs. And at a time when we need to make every penny count in terms of funding from the public sector, those sort of broader policy issues are some things that we need to think about. And we need to be reflected that within society, we're moving increasingly away from owning transport to accessing it. Look at how e-scooters and other forms of micro-mobility have been really embraced by the younger generation. It's a reflection that moving away from owning things to accessing things is as much a part of the transport system as it is other parts of the economy. All of this kind of sits within that sector where we've seen some really quite rapid changes in terms of e-services, e-retailing, about digital connectivity, about how business models are needing to change. If we think about transport, we think about how we need to have a conversation around how do we take account of the fact that an electrified road network means less vehicle excise duty and fuel duty. How do we take account of the fact that the rail model, where the traditional 5 days a week for many people going in on the train, has now changed to a different business model? How do we still need to tackle the business model for buses, which is still struggling in so far too many areas? We need to think about the business model for transport, but we need to think about that in the context of that wider social package that I was talking about earlier. I'll just talk briefly about the sort of rail sector, because we think there's a real opportunity for TFN to be leading the way, working with the Great British Railways transition team, because people mustn't forget we've actually got a form of devolution in the rail sector already in the north. Through the Rail North Partnership, TFN works with the department to oversee and manage the delivery of the Northern and Transpennine franchises, now working through in the control of government. And that gives us experience about how you make choices in the short term about how you spend money on services to support the North's requirements. But it also speaks about how we then work with the rail sector to think about the longer term planning. And there, our experience with the Manchester Recovery Task Force gives an illustration of how already you can start to bring together work around infrastructure, services, and public sector policy together to make a difference and to move forward. And certainly we're looking to use the model that we've got with the Manchester Recovery Task Force to start applying that to the East Coast Main Line, where there are some very challenging issues to be done in the short to medium term. But within that rail experience, we're promoting the idea of double devolution. So at a regional level, you build upon the work that we're doing through the Rail North Partnership, but you also reflect that with the emergence of the Metro Mayors, you have a mechanism, a governance, if you like, at a city region level, which allows the mayors to integrate what they're doing on local rail services with local bus and active travel measures. So this idea of double devolution within the rail sector is one that we're certainly advocating and putting forward as a potential way forward. I think then, just kind of drawing some of these thoughts together, I think as I look to the future, it's certainly challenging, but anybody who's known me or worked with me will know I see those as opportunities. And I think for me, the real challenge for the profession is about how we provide the leadership that will make the change happen. If I reflect on what's happened as a consequence of the pandemic, things that as a professional we've been arguing for needed to happen, which maybe haven't really taken momentum or happened, because there was an existential challenge and the business community needed to respond overnight, we saw changes in transport patterns and travel demand that would have taken years, we thought, to achieve. Now, some of those changes have come back, but some of those changes are embedding in the future moving forward. And so it reminds us that there is nothing fixed about the way in which we plan for and deliver investment in transport, that there is an opportunity to set out an ambition and a vision for the future. You need to be focused in outcomes. You need to have a systems approach to transport and indeed to strategic infrastructure. And you need to have an appraisal system that genuinely allows you to look across those policy areas. So it's not simply a question of looking at the profit and loss on the bus service, but understanding how that bus service supports social and health aspects as well, and making sure that our approach really understands and embraces that, because that's where we'll make a difference in terms of delivering outcomes. Fundamentally, this is about being evidence-based, but vision-led. It's about having centres of excellence that can be trusted centres of information and work with partners to deliver change. And I'm every confidence that Transport for the North moving forward will continue to be that centre of excellence and to continue to be that partner both for government and our partners locally to deliver the change that will actually enable people and places to realise their potential and to do it in a way that's sustainable for the longer term. Nick, I know there's a little bit more than 20 minutes, but hopefully that gives people a flavour of what we're about and what some of the opportunities are at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. That was very interesting, and there's certainly lots of plates spinning at the moment. We do have a few questions in already, and but I'm sure we'll have time to answer those. And so if people want to add some more, please put them in the Q&A. I will abuse the privilege of the chair and go first. I mean, I thought in particular from your talk there was not only a reminder that given the scale of the IRP, which is essentially a once in a lifetime investment, it does show the importance of getting it right first time, because a once in a lifetime opportunity doesn't come around again. And also that it's both speed and capacity that needs to be delivered. But most importantly, it seems to me that the approach that you're taking is that the point of transport planning is not to deliver transport schemes, but to improve people's lives and well-being but through the delivery of transport schemes. Now, I was wondering, perhaps if you could identify where you think the single biggest blocker is to that sort of switch in approach. What do you think is preventing the industry and bodies like TfN and DfT from being able to approach transport planning in that way?
I think it's actually two things, Nick. I know you said what's the one thing. I think it's a combination of two things. First of all, it's really getting our heads around what does it mean when we want to be outcome focused. And let me give you an example. We work closely with National Highways, and they do a lot of incredible stuff. I've seen some really great stuff around National Highways about diversity and inclusion within their communities. But it still feels to me sometimes that we're approaching the programme for investment as, here's a problem, how do we deliver a road scheme that is sustainable and has minimal carbon impact, rather than thinking about, here's the community, here's where we want to be in 20 or 30 years' time. This is what we need the road investment to deliver. So looking at it from the other end of the telescope, and it doesn't mean to say, and as you will have seen from the Major Roads report, there are going to be still needs to invest in our highway infrastructure, partly to unlock new growth, partly to actually provide the opportunities for the active travel and the public transport that we want to encourage. So let's get into a sort of a rather fatuous argument about whether we should be building more roads or not. It's about what kind of highway infrastructure to deliver those outcomes, and that outcome focus is really important. And linked to that is this thing about appraisal and understanding how an investment in transport actually delivers social, environmental, or economic opportunities and results. And so I do use buses as a good example here, because we know, don't we, that bus services are actually a really important part of the transport system. They carry more people than railways. They still struggle in many areas. But as I touched on in my talk, recognizing that those bus services also provide people who have no access to cars with their ability to maintain independent lives, you could actually argue that for the communities, they're an investment in the social and the health of that community. But we don't think in terms of that when we're doing the sort of the appraisal and the justification for the investment. Now, the Green Book revisions were trying to encourage us to do some of that. And certainly as work we're doing around the Northern Transport Charter, we're continuing to develop this thinking so that we have a Northern appraisal framework, one which actually allows us to start applying some of this thinking in a way that perhaps we haven't done before, and demonstrating why investment in transport is that much broader outcome than we're trying to just thinking about from a transport perspective.
Thank you, Martin. You touched on buses there and gone some way, I think, to answering this first question. There's another question that's coming on very similar lines, so I'll put the two together. Stephen Glaister has asked, and you've mentioned the importance of being an evidence-based body. Does the evidence from your analysis support the current balance of public funding for rail vis-a-vis buses? And a related question from Duncan O'Connor of BDB Pitmans. Another question on buses. Do you have any comments on the recent reports that DfT has reduced the Bus Back Better Fund from 3 billion to 1.4 billion?
Well, there's a couple of things in there for me there, Nick. One is, first of all, the scale of the submissions that put in by local transport authorities for funding, for consideration as part of the bus service improvement plans, I think is a reflection of how important buses are locally. And therefore, that in its own right tells us something that we need to think about. Secondly, I think, when I look at what we've done with the regional decarbonisation strategy, we've looked at what are we trying to achieve as outcomes. I keep coming back to this thing about outcomes. What are we trying to achieve in terms of the environment, the social, the economic? But we've also taken account of how lifestyles will change. And there's no certainty or guarantee that we can predict lifestyle, but it's about, if we're trying to achieve certain outcomes, and if you can make some reasonable assumptions about how things might change, you can get to a point where you can understand, what does the transport system need to do? And that's why we keep coming back to how important to the North the TfN's board's proposals for Northern Powerhouse Rail are, because it's that step change in the rail system, in infrastructure. Not just in terms of speed, but capacity. It's about connecting those parts of the region which are poorly performing in terms of productivity relative to the rest of the region, which is again why as TFN, we're concerned that the lack of sort of proposals that support and realise the potential of the West Yorkshire, the Hull, the Humber area, the East, these are gaps in the IRP which need to be addressed, because they are about how do you realise people's potential and the economy. So I think we've got an evidence base which shows that if you're going to achieve social progress with environmental progress and do it in a way that unlocks economic potential, you do need to invest more in public transport, whether it's rail or bus. And we need to think about, as I touched on, the business models for doing that in the context not just of rail and buses, but also of the highway and vehicle excise duty and fuel duty. These are issues which, frankly and rightly, the government's transport decarbonisation plan highlight as challenges. We see in the introduction to the transport decarbonisation plan the recognition that in relative terms, the cost of car has gone down, the cost of public transport has gone up. Now, the experience for the individual won't be that their cost of their travel has gone down. It will have, their experience personally will have been one of increase in cost. But from a transport planning perspective, we've got some messages there about there's something not going in the right direction when we're trying to achieve a set of outcomes. And this is not going to be easy, but I think we've got a moment in time over the next 18 months to really think about that. And I think, for me, Nick, this is where we also need to work closely with the National Infrastructure Commission, because as they look at the next National Infrastructure Needs Assessment, we need to be thinking in terms of the answer to some of the transport problems might be increased investment in ubiquitous digital connectivity. It might be about increased investment in the electricity generating and supply systems to electrify the transport system. We've got to think in terms of systems of strategic infrastructure. I think the National Infrastructure Commission has got an opportunity to take that leadership. We're certainly very keen to work with them and use our evidence base to help shape that. And I think it was also helpful to see government potentially increasing the remit, the financial remit of the National Infrastructure Commission, because again, that sends the right signal. But there's some really quite fundamental challenges there, and we've got to provide leadership. We've got to have a conversation with our communities which is engaging and meaningful and relevant, because I think without that, we're going to be planning things on a policy perspective, but the real life experience is going to be something very different.
Thanks, Martin. And one of the specific communities that has been raised here is by Roger Hayden, who said, not hearing much about Northeast England. We're usually an afterthought. If we are ever much of a thought at all, we desperately need investment and improvement to infrastructure. Interested to hear your comments on this.
I'd agree with him that entirely, that there's a need for investment in all parts of the region. And indeed, on the TFN board agenda tomorrow, we've got a discussion about the work that's already underway to set out a blueprint for the future for the East Coast Main Line, because that is important. But also important unlocking the investment in highway infrastructure that helps, for example, realise the potential, full potential of the Tees Valley Freeport. It's almost like sometimes we're almost, sometimes as a country, it almost feels like we're frightened to make the investment in infrastructure to allow a potential policy to be realised. So there's a lot of good activity, a lot of investment already coming into the Tees Valley Freeport. But if the investors could also see that we're anticipating its growth, that we're investing in the road and rail infrastructure to enable their investment to come online faster, quicker, that's where you can get the sort of the opportunity to really turbocharge the economy, but to do it in a way that's sustainable. So as TFN, I'm really very clear. We're there for the entire region, from the northwest to the northeast, from the east and west of the Pennines, from Cumbria across to Hull. We have to realise the potential of the region, and that's very much what I'm focusing TFN on moving forward.
Thank you. And in in a similar vein, then moving from Teesside to Merseyside, we have a specific question on the Port of Liverpool. Well, it's more general as well. I mean, this is from Stu Bennett of Save Rimrose Valley. Really positive about TFN, the fact it exists at all, and the organisation's long-term plans for our region, but in the short term is massively concerned about the continued reliance on road building, specifically the Port of Liverpool access road here in the north of our city, which would see an essential urban country park bulldozed for a road, facilitating more and more HGV movements. And at a time of climate emergency, with 21st century technology enabling fresh approaches to the movement of freight, do you agree that these should be prioritised over road, increased road provision? And perhaps as a more general version of the same question, Stuart Thompson has noted that TFN is now consulting on a freight and logistics strategy and wonders how you can best achieve a shift of freight away from roads and onto rail and inland waterways to help deliver on climate change.
So I'm not going to comment on the particulars about the access route into Liverpool, because I know that's a live issue locally, and I think it's right that that's debated and considered by the communities and the politicians in that area, rather than me opine here. I think the more general point, though, is there's twofold. Firstly, I'll go back to that point I made earlier about how investment in Northern Powerhouse Rail is about capacity as well as speed. If you've got an essentially two-track railway where you're trying to accelerate some trains, but you're still having to deal with the pressures of those maybe longer distance services with local services, with freight services, you cannot square the circle. You've got to accept you've got to increase capacity, which is why fundamental to the work of TFN's work on Northern Powerhouse Rail was the idea of not only investing, upgrading the existing TransPennine, but the step change in the terms of a new route from Manchester through Bradford to Leeds. You need both to be able to get that step change. And as I touched on earlier, Nick, when I see the demand for freight, rail freight, already back up to and beyond what we had pre-pandemic, it shows that there are changes happening within the freight distribution sector, and they're looking for that potential. When I look at what's happening coming out of the Port of Immingham, where flows of rail freight on sort of 50 to 75 miles now becoming profitable, it shows you there is potential. But let's be naive. When we're talking about freight and logistics sector, we've got to think in terms of a supply chain that's from a point where something's made to a point where something's delivered, whether it's a business or whether it's our own home. You cannot get away from the fact that a transport system will continue to need to have highways and vehicles on those highways as an important part of our transport system moving forward. To think otherwise is just frankly naive, and we need to, though, think about how we get a better balance. So again, that's why, sorry to kind of sound very much like a cracked record, but the essence of what the TFN board were setting out in their proposals for Northern Powerhouse Rail was you connect the great towns and cities from Hull across to Liverpool, from Sheffield through Leeds up to Newcastle. You connect those great towns and cities with a strategic rail network that actually can have the capacity and speed for both passengers and freight. And then you work with the partners at a local level to realise the potential for improved local public transport, active travel, to support what's happening at a local area. And I think that when you start getting it into that kind of approach, you can start to rebalance the way in which the transport system is operating. But as I touched on in one response to one of the other questions, let's also ignore the fact that some of the opportunities to reduce the pressure on the transport system comes perhaps from ubiquitous digital connectivity or increased energy systems and supply systems that allow things to happen differently. You've got to look at it in the round, and rather than trying to isolate one aspect of the transport system.
Thank you. And I suppose there's also the challenge of dealing with that last mile as well, and the proliferation of individual delivery vans and so on, and what that means for, you touched on clean air right at the start, and those issues as well.
There's this opportunity potentially. It comes back to what I was saying about focusing on outcomes, but also focusing on people. So there are changes in retail and e-services which are affecting the traditional high street. To me, what that creates is an opportunity. It creates an opportunity to redefine what our town centres are going to be like, to make them places, to keep them to be attractive places. But if they are also places where people can come in to collect their parcels, their goods, their services, but to do it in a different way, you can achieve some of these objectives and outcomes, but by creating a better place in which to live and to want to be, rather than necessarily going back to. And this is maybe one of the challenges with this phrase about build back better. It kind of runs the risk, if you're not careful, of saying how we were before is where we want to be again. And I think there's quite a few people who, where they've had the chance to do things differently, work more flexibly, which may be about working at home, but it may be about working at a local place rather than where they worked before. This idea of going back to what we had before probably isn't the right step. So it is about doing things better, but it's about looking to the future and using the change that's happened to give us the confidence to be even bolder, perhaps, about what we want our places to be like.
And not necessarily just going back, even to a better version. Clearly, Martin, there's a range of different outcomes, and with TFN having the geographical scope that it does, everything north of the D and the Humber, essentially. Your stakeholders, your members will have a range of different views. I mean, there's a question here from Ed Jordan. What are your thoughts on how your stakeholders can work more collaboratively together to minimise delays, and in part due to their individual governance requirements?
So I think this is where, I've worked at a regional level of strategic planning for over 20 years. The one thing that I am consistently struck by is that a group of regional political and business leaders coming together are going to be far better placed to understand the compromises and choices that need to be made than people sitting within London and Westminster. And that's not that's just reality. If you're embedded, if you're talking about your community with your fellow political and business leaders, you will understand both the opportunities and the challenges. And my observation, my experience consistently, Nick, has been, if you empower those people to and make them responsible for making choices, they will make them. And I think this is behind the message around the Northern Transport Charter that the business and political leaders of the North have been consistent about. They understand there is not a finite pot of public money. They understand the need to make choices, and they need to decide what are priorities. They want to work together, and they work together as Transport for the North. And they know that if they had a financial envelope within which to work, they would be able to and willing to make the kind of choices that they would have to make. And indeed, we've seen that with the Northern Powerhouse Rail proposition, because to get to the board's preferred approach, the political and business leaders had to make compromises themselves. They had to choose, well, this is going to be better than that for the benefit of the wider community. So it's not something that's new to them. They do it in their day jobs. And I think what my experience tells me, and experience perhaps when we had a system called regional funding advice back in the early 2000s, political and business leaders coming together, will make choices and prioritize within a financial framework. And then you can have a conversation with government. You can have a conversation with government and say, we can deliver you these outcomes for the funding that you've got available. If you have more funding, we can give you this. But you can also have a conversation with the private sector, because you can say to the private sector, here's our program of investment for the next 5 years or the next 10 years. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're trying to achieve in this location. Work with us to maximize the benefit of the public investment to leverage in even more private sector investment. And I think that clarity and that program approach gives confidence to the private sector investors that we're really looking to bring in to create those opportunities and to do those opportunities in a way that's sustainable.
Thank you, Martin. And you've actually started to pick up the next question that we've got coming in from Paul Tweedale of Tenbrook. Given the state of government finance, are you working with the private finance sector to ensure delivery of projects, and would private finance help speed up the process? And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about some of the conversations that you have been having.
Well, this does neatly lead on to the TFN board's response to the IRP, where if anybody who followed what the board resolution was, it was very much about wanting to work with government to explore the opportunity for different funding opportunities, maybe local contributions, maybe different styles or different types of investment, and that's an area of work that we're looking at the moment, because it does feel like if you view the investment as a long-term, the infrastructure as a long-term investment in a place, in a region, then it is an attractive proposition for investors. We just got to get better as a country to think about how do we create an environment in which we can have that conversation between public and private sectors in a way that's more productive and perhaps able to tap into what is available from the private sector in a way that's comfortable and acceptable for the public sector. But I think part of the key for that is understanding what is it that the public sector has got on offer, what are our priorities, what are our outcomes, what are we trying to achieve. And one of the things I learned, Nick, when I was at the Transport Systems Catapult, and we, as a public sector, we talk a lot about innovation. And one of my learning points from working at the Transport Systems Catapult was that the public sector does have a key role when it comes to innovation. It has a key role in identifying what is it we're trying to achieve, what are the outcomes, what are we trying to achieve for our citizens, for our residents. What we're not good at the public sector is then trying to make that innovation happen. We have to provide the leadership and define the issue, the challenge, but then find a way of working with the private sector that allows the innovators to come forward in a way that perhaps is a little easier than it is at the present. I kind of characterize it by saying, too often in the public sector, we want to both own the problem and the solution. Whereas I think when it comes to innovation, the public sector needs to own the problem and set the challenge, but then enable the private sector to do the innovation in a way that actually adds value.
And for more details, people should watch the board meeting tomorrow, presumably, as to what your plans are to be. Well, Martin, I think we've conveniently come to the end of our open questions. We're with a few more, a couple of minutes to go, and I think we may be able to let people go a couple of minutes early. So thank you very, very much for giving us a sort of tour de force through everything that Transport for the North has got on. It is clearly fast moving, and there are lots of balls in the air at the moment. I would like to, I'm sure if we're in the normal state of affairs, I'd ask people to give a round of applause right now. I'm sure they can each do that virtually, but it's mostly to thank you, Martin Tugwell, very much, and to say to everybody thank you again for attending. Our next business breakfast will be on the 22nd of February, where we are happy to be joined by Dame Glenys Stacey of the Office of Environmental Protection. Again, an organisation getting up and going and dealing with a wide range of challenges, some of which Martin has indeed touched on today. So I'm told this will be fairly abrupt now, so I'll just say goodbye to you all, and Ruth will press the button. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much.